Hey everybody, it's Wednesday morning. That means it's time to ask Chuck Dixon, number 49. So let's ask Chuck Dixon, which is me. No, I'm not going to continue talking about myself in the third person. All right. Kippabip says, when writing scripts, there appears to be a disparity in writing styles, as is inherent with any form of writing. It's the job of the author to describe the page to the artist. My question is this: is it of vast importance to be particularly particular in your requests for artwork? First frame, next frame, close up, far out, etc. Or do you think that describing the scene itself is enough? It depends on the talent of the writer or artist that you're working with, obviously. Depends on how good and how conversant they are with storytelling, what their level of craft is. Um, the better the artist, the more comfortable they are in the genre you're working in, the less you have to describe. I mean, literally, it's about being on the same page. I always use the example of, when I write a Western, I include a lot of reference. The art descriptions tend to go on and on because I want to make sure all the details are right. I'll even address body language, you know, weather, or organic stuff. But when I worked with guys like John Severin, all I had to do was write, guy rides down the street. They knew what, you know, John Severin knew what to do on a Western. I wasn't like, going to tell him anything that was going to improve his work anymore. Um, but, yes, I write full script, what's called full script versus Marvel style. Marvel style is a brief summary of the plot line. Back when I was at Marvel, sometimes the summary was only a few paragraphs. The artist had to do all the heavy lifting, storytelling wise. And then the art was sent back to the writer, who would make up stuff for the characters to say, which kind of explains the mediocre quality of a lot of comics in the 70s and 80s. But I write full script, everything broken down. Here we see a description for a double page spread. And, it gets somewhat detailed, but if you read this, there's quite a bit of flexibility. There's a lot of room here for interpretation. But it's important sometimes to be specific, to emphasize the most important part of the panel, to be particularly particular and let the artist know what you want. Best example I can think of is this scene from Hitchcock's Notorious, where that glass of milk was so important to the story. They wanted the reader's eye on it all the time because it was poisoned. I don't want to ruin the movie for you, but it's a poisoned glass of milk. Otherwise, what would make a glass of milk important? And in order to make sure your eyes stayed on it, that you understood the significance of this simple glass of milk, they actually put a little tiny light inside of it so that it glowed a little bit on screen. And that's the kind of thing I have to deal with all the time writing comics, is to make sure the artist understands what is most important in each panel to be emphasized. Or if there's a MacGuffin or a story element that needs to be prominent, I need to tell him that. Now, you may think, hey, Chuck's bossing the artist around, but most artists, 99.9% of them, appreciate it when you're clear about what it is you want. They want to help tell the story. Everybody wants to help tell the story. The colorist, the letterer, everybody wants to make sure nothing, well, if they're all doing the job right, that nothing gets in the way of the story. And they want to make sure they have an understanding of it. And the biggest mistake I ever see novice writers making is they'll be kind of wishy-washy in their descriptions, like, oh, I don't want to ask for too much, or I don't want to be bossy, whatever. Yeah, but it begins with you. It's a blank page before you've gotten started. Your words are what they're the first building block of the story, and the artist takes them and interprets them. But the artist has to know what it is you want. I mean, you don't want to sort of waffle a description of something that's important to the story, have the artist get it wrong, not his fault, get it wrong because you didn't, let him know how important this was, or provide reference, or even do a sketch yourself of whatever this detail is. And then you're 3 issues into the story, and now it's too late because he didn't establish it properly at the beginning. your story is becoming unraveled, or at least as it's less impactful than it would have been if you had been clear to the artist in the first place. And, because that's what collaboration is. You're both bringing all of your talents to bear on the project. I mean, why should a writer pull his punches or, hide his light under a bushel just because he thinks he's making it easier on the artist? Because you're not. You're not making it easier on the artist. The other thing, when you write for an artist, you have to remember, write. Some comic book writers love to say, "Well, there's no budget in comics. I mean, you can do 1 million spaceships, and it costs the same as one." Well, artists don't really appreciate that kind of talk because you just ask for a bajillion things in a panel, and they got to draw those bajillion things. And it only takes you seconds to write those words down, and they're going to be all day long doing that art. An example I can think of right off the top of my head, and Graham Nolan loves this example, is a panel from The Expendables Go to Hell. And if you read it, I'm asking for a lot here. This is it's probably the most demanding script I've ever written. And if I don't tell you that, Graham will. And here we have it. It says panel 5, low angle shot, looking past Barney and Murphy. That's Audie Murphy. That Murphy's booted feet in the extreme foreground. The street is packed with charging figures brandishing weapons. There's Aztecs, Huns, Vikings, and warriors in demonic samurai armor. Looming above and behind is an Assyrian war elephant with arrows streaming from an armored howdah. And this is the panel that Graham drew. Those words turned into this panel. Now you can see that Graham didn't follow what I wrote exactly, and that's fine because he's interpreting it. He's looking at the whole page and deciding how he wants to balance it out. But all the elements are here. See, I had a low angle shot looking past their booted feet. I was thinking that that angle would allow him to cover up a lot of the panel with foreground details. But Graham decided to go for these two figures, waist up figures in the foreground, and then the panorama behind. But it's all there: the demonic armor and the warriors, the Aztec and the Viking and the Roman and the Assyrian war elephant with arrows streaming from a howdah, and it's a fantastic panel. And and the thing is that I'm only seeing this because Graham has brought it up a number of times to me when we did a couple times we did podcasts together as an example of the written word turned into art, and also to bitch about how much detail I asked for, and and you know, and I only know the difference between the script and the art because of talking to him about it. I never go back to the scripts to check to see how close the artist hewed to my deathless words. Um, I look at the comic, and if the comic works, it works. If the artist made 1 million changes to it and it still works, it still works. As I ask all of my artists, the only thing I require of you is that you make me look like a genius. So, so there you go. Write what you feel is important. Don't leave anything out. Don't feel like you're being bossy. You're part of the collaborative team. You got to bring everything to it. 110% all the way. Okay. Kenny Todd. When you were in the Batman universe, were there villains Denny O'Neil didn't like to use at all? What was his favorite villain if he ever said, what did he think of Bane? Yeah, Denny had some opinions, and he wasn't afraid to let you know about them. And there were a lot of villains he didn't like. Chief among them was Mr. Freeze. Denny did not like Mr. Freeze. He didn't think that Mr. Freeze belonged in the Batman universe, because he felt he was too science fiction-y. And yeah, he was kind of right. But the other thing about Mr. Freeze was that he was an uninteresting character because he didn't have much of a background. He was a guy who lived in the cold, couldn't stand the heat, and froze things. And his crimes always had something to do with ice or snow or whatever. So he wasn't a terribly interesting character at that time. Until the guys, Paul Dini and Bruce Timm and those guys in Batman the Animated Series gave him an interesting backstory, made him a somewhat sympathetic villain. He has his wife who's frozen in stasis. And of course, he's handicapped frozen. He's got to remain at sub-zero temperatures to survive. This tragic sort of universal monster is kind of a figure that the animation guys turned him into. But long before that, I got hired by Denny to work on Robin, and I did 3 Robin miniseries before we did a Robin monthly. And the second Robin miniseries, the best-selling of them all, pit Tim Drake, the brand new Robin, against the Joker. And I suggested to Denny that the Joker hadn't been seen in the comics for a little while, and I said to really make a splash. And I said, and I also wanted to address something I didn't like every time the Joker appeared. In comics, even when I was a kid, the Joker would appear and he'd be committing his crimes, and I'd be reading the story and I would go, "Didn't Batman put him in jail last time? How did how is he just suddenly out of jail?" So I said, well, when I bring the Joker back, I want to show the prison break. I want to show him getting out of jail, and of course, it's not just paroled or digging a tunnel or anything boring like that. I want to show a clever Byzantine Joker kind of prison escape, which I did. And I said he's returning to the Gotham crime scene after a long absence. How does he reestablish himself quickly? And I suggested that he kill an established Batman villain and take over that guy's gang. Joker's in a hurry. He's got no time to find his own gang, hire his own henchmen. So he's going to kill some Batman villain and take his gang over. And I said, Denny, are there any Batman villains you'd like to see dead or you don't need anymore? And there was no hesitation. Denny said, Mr. Freeze. So the Joker kills Mr. Freeze. Now, a few years later, a crossover event interrupted the flow of the Detective Comics. Something happened so that a crossover was going to land right in the middle of an arc that Graham Nolan and I were working on. And the only way around it, and this was fine with me because I worked far ahead, I was way ahead of schedule. They suggested, why don't you write a one-off story to appear before that arc? This way the crossover won't interrupt it. So the crossover would come between the inventory issue and the start of this next arc. And I said, fine. And they said, but you have to do it in a hurry because we're up against it deadline-wise, and we do have an artist waiting. They had Barry Kitson waiting to draw it. So I had very little time to write the story. In fact, I wrote it over a weekend, which was unusual. I didn't like working weekends, but I wrote it over a weekend. And the only thing I could think of was, well, what if Mr. Freeze isn't dead? I mean, he's Mr. Freeze. Would shooting him necessarily kill him since his metabolism is so slow? I mean, Mr. Freeze is not about to bleed to death. And I thought, what if he's still alive in the Gotham mortuary or the morgue? And so I wrote a story in which Mr. Freeze comes back. And wow, Denny was really, really ticked about it. He called me, he was really angry. I didn't give you permission, because he wasn't editing Detective at the time. It was Scott Peterson. I didn't give you permission to bring Mr. Freeze back. And I said, well, Denny, we're going to have to bring him back eventually. And I need, I needed a story. You've been backed into corners like this. There was no time. I needed a story, and this is the one I thought of. And it's a good story. I mean, I thought it was a good story. It's a good, solid story. The return of a character we thought was dead. And I thought it was logical. Mr. Freeze was not killed by the Joker. He was just put into some sort of suspended animation and literally kept on ice. And then he felt better about it. And then when the animated series came along, felt a lot better about it because we were going to eventually have to bring back Mr. Freeze. And here we'd already done it. He was already in place, ready to go for the cartoons. Another villain that Denny didn't like for much the same reasons that he didn't like Mr. Freeze was Clayface. He felt that he was, especially the way he had evolved into like this giant clay monster, this porcelain Hulk. He didn't like that at all. So he, too science fiction-y. And I didn't really care that much for Clayface myself. In fact, I was offered a chance to do an arc in Legends of the Dark Knight featuring Clayface with Kiki Alcatena, one of my favorite artists to work with, would have been on the art. And I love working with Kiki, but I just don't like Clayface. I said, Alan Grant would be a much better writer for this particular arc, and he loves working with Kike too. So they gave it to Alan, and Alan and Kike did an amazing story, far better than anything I would have done. Because Alan really he dug Clayface. He all versions of Clayface Alan was into. Now, as far as how Denny felt about Bane, I don't know. I mean, I guess he loved him because it was successful. You know, he fit the bill literally for Nightfall. He was everything we needed in that bad guy. And so I imagine Denny loved him. I can't remember Denny ever writing Bane though, but he always had nice things to say about my my Santa Prisca amigo, Mr. Bane, Senior Bane. David Jordan, what happened with the excellent run of G.I. Joe you and Mike Costa had going in IDW? It seemed to just fizzle out after you two left. Why did you leave? Well, I never wanted to leave. I wrote a lot of G.I. Joe. I was writing 2 monthlies at one point and a bunch of miniseries and specials. I was kind of a G.I. Joe go-to guy because once again, I write way ahead of schedule. So I've always got a little room there. Hey, oh, you need a script in 2 weeks? Yeah, I can fit that in. And I loved working on it. I loved the characters. I was honored to work on anything that Larry Hama had such a hand in, play in that universe, that incredibly dense, well-populated universe that he had created. And I really dug it. The fact that you think that it fizzled after Mike Costa and I left, well, thank you. Thanks for the kind words. And yeah, it kind of did. It kind of lost its direction. And I don't know who to blame for that. I don't know if it was IDW. I can't imagine Hasbro would have, you know, you know, kicked their own brand name in the crotch the way that IDW did. Hiring people that obviously didn't care about the franchise at all. I mean, other than Larry. I mean, Larry's ongoing work is Larry's ongoing work, and it's classic GI Joe. It's the real deal. It's the real Tabasco. But these other ancillary titles just seem to entirely miss the point of the series. Uh, it obviously didn't understand the audience for these books, and like so many other comic book properties these days, they just turned it into a sounding board for their own political ideas, far left political ideas for the most part. You know, GI Joe really shouldn't be dealing with transgender issues and things like that. It's not what the book is about. It's a war book. It's a military fantasy book, and it's about loyalty and service and courage and keeping your word and things like that. It's not about whatever the hell they made it about. You know, I saw some of the work, years after Mike and I had left, and it was just unrecognizable. The entire property was just unrecognizable. Jack Nero 99. One of the, in my eyes, most underrated Batman stories is Prodigal. What can you tell us about the process and ideas behind making Dick Grayson Batman, even if just for a short stand-in? And what are your thoughts on Grant Morrison making Bat Dick the status quo for a few years? I don't even know what that means. I'm not a big Grant Morrison follower, so I don't. Did they turn Dick Grayson into someone insufferable and arrogant? Yeah, I wouldn't like that idea. But yeah, I don't know what that. I can't really comment. Prodigal basically came around because Jean-Paul Valley was so despised by the readers that our sales began to crater. John Paul Valley was supposed to continue on as Asbats for a longer period than he did, but we had to cut it short because we were losing readers. And I can understand why. We created a Batman they would hate, and they hated him, so they didn't want to read about him. So, and this was strange for Denny because Denny didn't think a lot about comic book logistics. I've discussed that in previous videos. He didn't think about or consider them important, and I always did. But in this case, he did. He thought, well, Bruce Wayne's had his back broken. He needs a longer recovery time, and we still have more Bruce Wayne story to tell. Bruce Wayne away from the Batcave, and we don't want to cut that short. And so the idea came up, well, wouldn't Dick Grayson be the logical choice to temporarily take over until Bruce Wayne is fully recovered from his spinal injury. And so this was born. And the added benefit of being, not only will the readers be happy to see Asbat's gone, they'll be delirious that Dick Grayson is going to be Batman for a while. Because, it's a cool story. It's something we always wanted to see. And, Dick Grayson had stood in for Batman in the past, but now it was official. He was going to be Batman until Bruce Wayne was ready to come back. And it just seemed to be a natural story. And yeah, it's I don't know if it's so much underrated as a little bit forgotten. It's like a forgotten chapter in the Nightfall saga, but it was extremely popular at the time and brought our sales back up, which was, in the end, the whole point. Levi Sweeney, what exactly is the Invisible Hand School of Comic Book Creation? I've heard you talk about it in the past in the podcast, but what exactly is it, and who are the major figures in it? Well, I don't know who the major figures would be, but I know who I would pick if I were going to make a list of Invisible Hand writers. Harvey Kurtzman would be number one. Harvey Kurtzman is most famous for having created Mad Magazine. And I guess I kind of, in putting this video together, I kind of had to think about this. And I guess the reason why he was an invisible hand writer, which means he writes in a way that does not draw attention to the writing. He wrote in a way that emphasized the story, made you think about the story, make you forget that there are people creating this and just do the story, not show off how talented or smart or brilliant or clever he was. Just do the story, and do the story in such a way that the art told the story. The words were there to assist the art in telling the story. He did very visual work, even as opposed to everything else being done at EC at the time. Kurtzman's stuff was more art driven, far more art driven than the famous EC horror comics, which were very word heavy, lots of description, not invisible handwriting at all. Very dense text, lots of dialogue. Kurtzman only put in enough dialogue to carry the story, and only enough narration to set the scene. And I think that begins with Mad, because he was originally a humor writer. He had his own one-page strip called Hey Look at, I forget what publisher. I don't know, was that Marvel? I don't remember. And which, he moves into Mad Magazine. And when you write humor, you've got to write Invisible Hand, because, it's all about the laughs. It's not about you. It's not about, hey, you don't tell a joke and then go, get it, see how smart I was, see how I figured that out. You never explain the joke. And I think that would be the beginning of his Invisible Hand approach. The other thing is that he was an artist himself. And so, he knew how to balance the words and pictures. He knew how to make that work. He knew everything about the medium. And what he didn't know, he invented. His other big contribution was the war comics at EC, and these were brilliant, and these are perfect examples of Invisible Hand. Almost entirely art driven. The dialogue often, there's only enough dialogue there to inform you about location and character. In the case on the screen now, to describe the technical aspects of setting a booby trap, things like that. So for me, he was the first real Invisible Hand writer, even more so than Carl Barks. Although Barks and John Stanley as well were Invisible Hand, but Kurtzman is the one who first made an impression on me, where I first noticed this balance between words and pictures. The pictures driving the story forward on their own, and the words, enhancing the pictures. Another guy who's not often thought of as he's thought of as prolific more than competent is Bob Kanigher. But Bob Kanigher was a great comic book writer. Yeah, he created some silly stuff like Metal Man and things like that. And his Wonder Woman stuff is freaky. But he was incredibly prolific. He turned out lots of pages, and he's justifiably remembered most for his war comics. And he did have a feel for this genre, unlike, you know, it was kind of Kurtzman-like, but Kanigher had his own stamp. Kanigher would do theme stories, you know, where it was some GI's birthday, and that was the theme of the story. They keep returning to a birthday theme, or you know, we're sitting ducks, we're lame ducks. That was a story where it was about a bunch of guys get shot down and they have to defend their crashed plane from, you know, every German in creation coming to kill them. But as the war comics kind of matured and had to grow up to match the audience that was reading them during the Vietnam era, the stories took on, you know, a more, like I said, like a more mature, adult, grown-up feel, and a lot more emotional impact. And as you can see here, much like Kurtzman comics, entirely visually driven. Of course, he was working with the best artists in the business, in my opinion. And these are comics I paid a lot of attention to because I love them. I just love these comics. And as you get into the early 70s, I will argue there were no better comic books produced ever in the history of comics in America than DC War comics in the very early 70s. Everybody was at the top of their form doing just astounding work. And Kanigher was one of them. You know, he brought a gravity and a seriousness to the work without ever drawing attention to his own writing. It was all about driving that story forward. Now, Archie Goodwin, I've mentioned him over and over and over again. If you've never heard of Archie Goodwin, then you must have not watched any video of mine previous to this one. But Archie's the biggest influence on my writing, and he was very much a proponent of the Invisible Hand school. With his contributions, and the earliest stuff I saw by him was at Warren Comics with Creepy, Eerie, and Vampirella, and he was the go-to guy. He wrote most of the stories in all the early issues. Got to work with literally the best American comic book talents available, and took full advantage of that, and told EC type horror stories in more of a Harvey Kurtzman style, relying more on the art to tell the story, more cinematic storytelling, allowing the artist their head to do their best work, just visually drive that story forward instead of yak, 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 like a lot of EC horror stories were. And then the mind blower for me was when Warren decided to publish a war comic called Blazing Combat. It only lasted 4 issues because they ran into trouble with a whole lot of people, veterans organizations and the post office and everything else, because this was a lot more grim of a war comic than Sergeant Rock and Haunted Tank were, especially in this period, mid 60s. And we were in the middle of the Vietnam War, and this comic was kind of seen as, a hippie war magazine. Though, if you read it now, it was anything but. And Archie does some of his best writing of all time, working with the biggest talents in the business: Russ Heath, Alex Toth, John Severin, Wally Wood. And this, I treasured those 4 issues of Blazing Combat, which were very, very hard to find. But again, this is invisible handwriting at its finest, where you are compelled forward by the panels, what's in the panels, rather than the words. And of course, Archie went on to work at Marvel, Iron Man, and the Hulk, and he did terrific work for them, sort of aping Stan Lee's style. For my money, he was the best Stan Lee imitator out there, and he would come up with tremendous stories that always featured rising action and rising stakes and a little touch of humor, that little touch of self-effacing humor that Stan Lee always put into his work. Archie just got it. He just got it. He was a natural. And the other big, milestone, I mean, Archie continued to write on into the 80s, but his other big milestone was his brief run as editor on Detective Comics. And he basically came off of what Denny O'Neil had been doing before him, and bumped it up a little bit more. And what he did was he introduced the Invisible Hand style of writing to Batman. And everything that comes after, Killing Joke, Batman Year One, everything else is in the shadow of this brief run by Archie Goodwin on Detective Comics. And most of these aren't even written by him. They're written by other people, but under Archie's direction. And Archie I never talked to him about this, and I should have. He must have had very specific designs on his Detective Comics run, because there's not a sameness to the stories. They're all very different. But the approach of all these stories is more cinematic than any Batman story prior to it. They're more visually driven. They're more terse. The text is leaner. The dialogue is more pointed and more clever. Archie must have given direction to everybody. This is the kind of Batman story that I want to do. And as I said, everything that came after owes a big debt. And I know that all of the creators that I'm not referring to, but all the creators' works that I'm referring to, I know they would agree to me, and I know they had to have been fans of this, unfortunately, brief run. I think it was only 10 issues, but just brilliant. I mean, I just went to the newsstand every week, couldn't wait to see the next issue of Detective to see what Archie did. So that's what the invisible hand writing is. It's literally invisible. Don't call attention to yourself. It's like the best colorists in the business. You probably don't know their names because they don't draw attention to themselves. The flashy colorists get all the attention because you notice the coloring. Well, you're not supposed to notice the coloring. It's like if you go to the movies, you're not supposed to notice the costuming and the set design. If they're good, in fact, the better they are, the less you'll notice them. And that's just the difference between top shelf work and amateur hour. So there you go. I hope I explained that to your satisfaction. Brian White, as a fellow Submariner fan, I'm wondering if you ever got a chance to write him. I have never seen any, so I presume not. Would you be interested in writing a Namor story in the future, and what would it be about? Yeah, I'm big Submariner fan, and always have been. I mean, he's one of the Golden Age characters that worked for me. And he's one of the few Golden Age characters whose Golden Age stories are readable and fun. And I just like the fact that he's got such a high opinion of himself. I mean, who else says Imperious Rex? He is Imperious Rex. He just thinks he's better than everybody. He's the smartest guy in any room he's in. He's the strongest guy, even when it's demonstrated to him that he's not the strongest guy. When Thor or the Hulk, beat him to within an inch of his life, he's just never going to give up. And he's a bit of a romantic as well. Now, Graham Nolan and I have long talked about, working on Fantastic Four together, and we did actually propose a Submariner-centric Fantastic Four story. We pitched it to Marvel a while back, but this was after I was put on the naughty list at Marvel, and so it didn't go anywhere. But the basic story is that the moon of Europa, it's one of Jupiter's moons, is in reality it's a frozen ball of ice with oceans beneath the ice of actual water, that are miles and miles deep. And the theory amongst xenobiologists is that there could very well be life. If there's going to be life anywhere in our solar system other than Earth, it would be on the moon of Europa because it actually has free-flowing water and all the minerals and building blocks that would be necessary to create life. And in our story, the FF I can't remember the details of the story, but they get like a distress signal or whatever from under the ice in Europa. And who better to go along and explore this brand new ocean with them, the subterranean ocean, this mystery world, than Namor. And of course, part of the story and complications is the Fantastic Four convincing him to go along. And I can't remember all the details of the story, but it was pretty cool, and I would have loved to have seen it done. And of course, our version of Namor would have been very close to the Kirby version in the early issues of Fantastic Four, when he was at his most imperious, his most Rex. Would have been fun to work on. Maybe someday, right? All you kids start writing letters. Like that would do any good. Okay. That's it for me this week. Coming up in just a few weeks is a brand new digital comic book platform called ArcTunes. It's from Archhaven Comics, and you can participate through Patreon. Through Patreon, you can help fund this project for $1, $3, $5. On some of the platforms, you get some goodies, some tchotchkes, and it's we're going to launch with a lot of new comic book series you've never seen before, and a lot of different genres from some of the top talents in the business. I don't want to go into too many details, but it's going to be around, and you're going to be able to check it out because it's going to be free. You're going to be able to read high resolution, quality comic book work in weekly format on any device you can imagine. And it's going to have all kinds of features that none of these other digital comics platforms have. And so if you want to be a part of it, you want to get on the ground floor, get in before everybody else, go to Patreon and Archhaven Comics, and we would all appreciate it so we can feed our starving artists. They work so very hard. All right, that's it. I'll see everybody down the road.